Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. If you've been on one of these with us before, you know what I'm going to ask next. Tell us where you're tuning in from in the chat. It's a lot of fun. I'm in Seattle. Priya's in Germany. Fanny's in California. Ballard, Vermont. Lovely, thank you. Minneapolis, Nashville, London, Seattle, Central Virginia. Thank you so much, everyone. The U District. All right, we'll leave it for just a few more seconds and then we will get started. Mexico City, welcome. Happy Thanksgiving from New Jersey, and to you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop in Seattle that's called Booklarder. And we typically do lots of cooking classes and author talks at the kitchen in our shop. And since we are in a slightly different situation right now, we have taken our talks and classes to Zoom. The great part of that has been that we get to welcome people from literally all over the world to these author talks, both as guests and also as authors and participants. And so we get to do these sort of really fun conversations where we pull people together from lots of different places. And it's been really wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted today to welcome Priya Basil. She is a novelist and an activist and the author of Be My Guest, which is the book that we will be talking about today. She is, as I said, joining us from Germany, so it's 9 o'clock at night there. So thank you, Priya, for staying up with us. She will be in conversation with a fellow writer, Fanny Singer. Fanny released a memoir in April called Always Home. The two of them will talk about Be My Guest, and we will leave time for questions as well. So please use the Q&A button on Zoom for your questions, and we will get to those at the end of the conversation. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Of course, the book is available at booklarder.com, and you can support this talk and our small bookstore by purchasing the book from us if you are so inclined. I know lots of you have done that already, so thank you so much for that. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Priya and Fanny now. Welcome, Priya and Fanny.
Hello.
Hi.
Priya, it's such a pleasure to be here in this distant place with you. I found your book, Be My Guest, to be very, very thought-provoking, and have really been mulling it over sort of in a sort of deeper, more profound way than I think many books have struck me in this time. So as much as I would like to have a kind of lighthearted pre-Thanksgiving rumination on food and the sort of generosity of table, I think there are some really provocative ideas that you bring up that I think that I would love to get into. And one of them you bring up very early on. I found it just incredibly compelling, this idea that both hospitality and hostility are birthed from this ancient Indo-European root, gosti, which means both host, guest, and stranger. As you describe it, the trio of roles through which we shift all our lives. As I understand it, the word didn't so much describe either actor, which is to say either the guest or the host, so much as the action that takes place between the two of them, the relationship itself, if you will, and perhaps even maybe the atmosphere of the relationship. And reading your book, I couldn't help but notice that you had a sort of prevailing anxiety in looking at how hosting and being the guest of, and how hospitality in fact worked within your life, but also within the life the people in your community, which is to say, like, had you prepared something that your guests would like to eat? Did you make enough food? Had you given your grandmother enough compliments on what she'd made? Had you eaten enough of her food? And then also this really interesting question that I'd love to get to a little bit more later, but of the question of generosity, that was sort of a doctrine of the Sikh temple, your childhood and familial religion, in which at the langar, which is the free meal, you can correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but the free meal following service, in which anyone, the proverbial stranger, could come in and take part. So I know this is a little abstract, but I wonder if you could talk about this idea of the sort of atmosphere of the guest-host relationship.
Oh, thank you so much for that generous opening, Fanny. I'm really delighted to be able to talk to you today, to be part of this book ladder conversation, and to be with all the people who've joined us. It feels really special.
Sorry, I just jumped in. I was like, I want to get to the heart of it right
away. No, it's
really
nice. Yeah, but I also just wanted to, before I forget and get really caught up in your questions, just to say how nice it is to be here with everybody. When I made that discovery in my research of this Indo-European root word gosti and how it opened up onto these three different roles, host, guest, and stranger, it was like probably one of the most important discoveries of this book for me. And it became a sort of lighthouse that guided me through all the writing, because it just seemed so astonishing to me that this feeling that I had that these roles are actually quite, they blur into each other quite often, and that we move through them sometimes almost without even noticing, like in the space of a conversation, with the way that we listen to somebody, or the way that we suddenly feel completely put off or alienated, that just in this small space of an intimate conversation between two people, you could be sort of making that journey. And at the same time, of course, it applies in a much broader sense to a society and the way we treat different people within that, whether through the law or, at our own table. So it was just a really, really productive and beautiful encapsulation of the sense that I have that how we navigate being in either of those roles really defines who we are and what our relationships are with other people. And I think for me also this was because host and guest are, I guess, are things that we quite easily or we think of as quite nice roles to be in, to obviously, at least in terms of the table and being invited or inviting, because it's sort of, I mean, you get to choose often. You can say no to invitation. You choose who gets to come, and even though there might be kind of frictions or awkwardness, it's generally a situation in which we've decided a lot of things, and we can sort of, to some extent, we know what the outcome might be. But that stranger element, this is what sort of throws things really often, and this idea of something unexpected entering the encounter, the meeting, the situation, and what that does to us. I just found that really, really fascinating. And I loved it that all these possibilities to explore were contained within this one word and its sort of historical meaning.
Which I think ends up being kind of a beautiful metaphor in a way for how you approach this book, which is like, it feels like it may have begun in some way as a memoir, a recollection of how through food and through family, you came to understand these questions of what hospitality meant. But then it brings up so much, in fact, it permits the entry of so many other issues. I mean, it's an incredibly broad ranging book, given how concise it is also in a way. And I mean that as a compliment, that we touch on so many different things, from climate change and the implications of a diet, to food waste, to the refugee crisis, to nationalism, to activism, etc., and to cooking, you know, which is at the heart and also at the beginning of the book. You enter on this wonderful scene of your mother cooking your favorite dish, and you never feeling like there's quite going to be enough, you know, that there's, and that dish already is a symbol of a multiplicity of things, you know, that it's the relationship you have with her, but it's also the relationship that you have with others. And I like what you just said so much about the constant sort of um, shifting. And it reminds me of the really wonderful quote, and I will read it, that of Jacques Derrida, that and you come back to him and his philosophy frequently in the book, but you quote him as saying, hospitality should be neither assimilation, acculturation, nor simply the occupation of my space by the other. That's why it has to be negotiated at every instant. And the decision for hospitality, the best rule for this negotiation, has to be invented at every second, with all the risks involved. And it is very risky. It is the responsibility of the other, but of the other in me, before me, of the other as me, end quote. And I mean, I know exactly why that appealed to you, but because it seems to encapsulate so many of the questions that you raise in the book. I wonder at what point he kind of came onto your radar, or did that was that as much of a lightning rod for you as it felt like for me reading?
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing how many sort of very sort of key moments there were in writing this book. I mean, I have to say it does, as you hinted, begin with my family. I don't think I could have written this book not coming from the family that I come from, which is a family that is absolutely obsessed with food and cooking, and especially as a way of being together and bringing people together and controlling people. And I say in the book, you know, my family visits supermarkets the way other people do art galleries, and you know, several supermarkets in one day is not a big deal. Of course, now it's different because now one tries not to go to supermarkets, as you know, if one doesn't have to. But this inheritance of sort of overdoing it, of abundance, as a sign of love, is one that I really cherished and also suffered from, and particularly in the form of my grandmother Mumji, who you mentioned, where this hostility part of hospitality, of Gosti, really came to the fore, because with her it was always this overcooking, and then this pressure to eat more than you wanted, and then to praise, because you know this was the point of it all, that she would feel really valued and really important. And so yeah, there was this sort of mixed inheritance in this over the top style of cooking that was there. And of course, with my grandmother, it was also related, I think, to a generational thing and a gender thing, because, you know, in her generation, there were not so many opportunities for women like her. And the kitchen became her domain in a way that nowhere else could. And she really then used it. I mean, she really used food as a weapon of power and control. I only realized that much later when I was writing and reflecting, that I thought, you know, that was her only means of asserting herself in certain ways. And of course, in a way, I sort of respect that, and yet I have to confess it was not easy to bear, even if it was delicious. And you mentioned the langar in the Sikh tradition. So my family was Sikh. I became an atheist then in my teenage years, but I grew up within this tradition, and as part of the Sikh culture, at the temple, there is this community meal that anybody can volunteer to cook there, and then anybody can come and eat and partake of the meal. And for me, growing up in Kenya, where there was a very divided society at that time. So Kenya gained its independence from Great Britain in 1963. I was born in 1977. Growing up through the 80s, this is like a newly decolonized society, and so many of the racial divisions that had become part of the structure of society during the colonial period remained. So the Indian community kept very much to itself, and we didn't have any Black Kenyan friends, and we had almost no white friends, and it was just a very kind of enclosed existence. And then to be at the temple and to hear about this idea of a meal that was open to anyone was, I just remember that just being struck by this idea. It seemed so astonishing.
Mhm.
And what was also then really puzzling was that if anybody could come, how come there were only ever other Indian Sikhs there? And I couldn't really articulate these things then. I wasn't really a child who, I think, was able to deal with these things. It was only much later that, as a sort of political person, these things came back and troubled me, and I tried to work them out in a different way. And when I read Jacques Derrida as also as part of my research for this book, suddenly there was this connection between that question of my childhood, of the open invitation but who comes, and this idea of unconditional hospitality that Derrida lays out in his book Of Hospitality. And it's a really, I think, overwhelming notion, unconditional hospitality. And Derrida says immediately that it's impossible. And yet he nevertheless suggests that, this is a premise from which we should try to approach the world and our relations with others. And I just love the idea, because I feel like we're in a time where the idea of who belongs where is being ever so narrowly defined. And I wanted some other vision of how we might be together. And even if it's impossible, it seemed to me that this impossible was more worth trying than the other impossible of keeping people out of our societies and our countries, because the price of the other impossible is just, I think, much higher and much uglier. And so there was this line that I could see between these childhood ideas of community and belonging and my contemporary self living in Europe, where, we have this tremendous project, the European Union, where until a couple of years ago, before the UK left, there were 28 countries, who had open borders, and their citizens could move across this continent and live and work in other places, without showing passports, without needing to get permission or fulfill any conditions. And this is why I was able to move to Berlin so easily. And so I had experienced this unconditional hospitality in a certain way. And yet it was clear to me that this hospitality was conditional, because on Europe's outside borders, people die on boats trying to get here. And so this conundrum of these ideals that we have, which we had in Sikhism and which we have in the European Union, which we somehow fail to live up to, at least not for everybody. This connection was very striking to me, and I felt that this idea of unconditional hospitality was all the more valuable as one to sort of hold by and try to use as an orientation, and not because I feel at all up to it. I feel totally, I think I haven't encountered a more challenging idea, and I certainly don't manage to live up to it. But I think for me, this idea, what it meant was simply to try to remain open in any situation, and not to feel like the outcome should be decided in advance.
I think, to stick for a moment with our sort of exploration of etymologies, you also do bring up the ancient Greek word xenia, which we're all too familiar with at the moment, thanks to just the rampant xenophobia, which is a sort of product of this uptick in nationalism, especially in the US, and amplified by Trump, and by policies such as Brexit, et cetera. But I had always understood it, and I think we all understand that word, xenophobia, to mean fear of strangers or fear of the other. But I was interested to learn that, in fact, it also, like gosti, means stranger, host, and guest. And so it implies almost a kind of fear of self, or a fear of what we might become. And I think that that's something that we're seeing so much in the US right now. And I've just been working tirelessly trying to get Joe Biden elected in this most recent election. I've been more involved in activism around getting out the vote and fighting voter suppression than I ever imagined I would have been in the past. And this question of shifting demographics and how this changes and provokes a certain kind of anxiety in a group of people, especially who presume themselves to be somehow native, even if they themselves arrived in this land through various colonial or imperialist projects. And I wonder, I mean, it's a little bit of a philosophical question, but this idea of sort of fear of ourselves, what you make of that, and how that might come into play in terms of these anxieties that we have about what we can extend, how far we can extend ourselves.
Mm. No, it's a really important question. And I think this idea of the stranger in the self is one that that did really animate my thoughts as I was writing. Because I think there are that word stranger is one we tend to apply to the other, particularly the person that we don't want to recognize or acknowledge or feel threatened by. And I think it's no coincidence that one of the first things we learn as children is don't talk to strangers. That word is immediately imbued with a kind of suspicion and even a sense of fear. And I'm actually really interested in how we ourselves become strangers, even to ourselves in certain moments. I mean, I think we all have moments when, we don't recognize ourselves because we have behaved in a way that we wish we hadn't, lost the temper, said things we didn't want to, and or when you're ill and your body just doesn't do what you want it to and you feel totally estranged from yourself. So there are these moments. And then I think there are also political moments in which, for whatever reasons, because of being insecure or just not wanting to change or just not accepting to give something up. And I'm not saying that these are easy things to do, but there's always like a relation in which we do it, like to what end. And I think an inability to do that can estrange you from yourself and from others, because I think that, I mean, this is not to say that some people are not very consciously just cruel and unfair and, with wanting to do harm to others. But I do think that there are circumstances in which many people are just under pressures that make them act in ways that perhaps in a calmer moment or a more reflected moment, if they manage to have that, they would not recognize themselves. And they would be like, oh, that's not me. Or if you described very objectively, perhaps what they were doing, or if somebody who they might want to listen to describe that, maybe they would recognize this person who they wouldn't say is them. So there is a very interesting dynamic there that you're describing of ways in which we don't live up to who we say we are, and that dissonance.
There's also this question too, right, of how much there is to share, how much that we have is finite, that what we have is finite and it can't be elastic, it can't be flexible. So if someone else arrives, we will have less for ourselves, and you speak, I love the little anecdote about how when you had, I think, a younger brother arrived or a younger sister, and you absolutely did not want another sibling. You had an older sister already, and you couldn't imagine your family unit accommodating the arrival of someone else who might just invariably would diminish perhaps like the amount of affection or love that you felt you were receiving. And then with the arrival of this other human, you were able to grasp perhaps more tangibly how certain commodities, so to speak, are extremely elastic, that there's no that one more person at the table doesn't actually diminish and in fact will enhance the experience that you're having there. And I really love that concept. It returns a few times in the course of the book. And it's something definitely that defined my childhood. I mean, my mother is, I think, the most generous person I know. And I mean, genuinely generous in that way, where I kept thinking, like, does she expect anything in return? Like, really questioning this as I was reading your book. And I think, honestly, she doesn't ever expect or want anything in return. And so I kind of come to this idea, or the paradox that you bring up, of the hospitality industry, um, which is this idea that hospitality is at its core transactional, which I think, my mom now, her restaurant Chez Panisse will be 50 years old in 2021. And, and it's maybe just the result of her being a really genuinely abysmal businesswoman, financially speaking, but the restaurant was never really designed to make money. It was always too concerned with the welfare of the people, which is not just the guests, but really also the employees. So to profit was never something that it was expected to do. And it hasn't really. I mean, it's a restaurant that is on paper one of the most successful restaurants in the US, but doesn't actually make very much money because it's reinvesting it in the people. And I always think of this ethos of hers as having been influenced not just by like the 70s communes, and the restaurant is governed by a board of directors still. It has there's a community, really a community that's responsible for its function. But also to this one moment in Turkey when she was in her 20s and she was traveling across with a friend, and their car broke down, and they were near this little town, and this young boy who must have been like only 13, already orphaned, and had a smaller sister, and had very, very little, but he let her stay on their land, camped out there overnight while the car was fixed. And when she woke up in the morning, she had a bowl of fresh goat's milk at the foot of her tent, and knowing that he had probably just that to offer, and yet he had given her that with absolutely no expectation of anything in return. And I love that story, and it's clearly had so much to do with the way that my mother thinks about giving and generosity in the context of even a business. But I just
Mm.
wonder, sort of what you think of this new development in this, like this paradox of the hospitality industry, and like whether it's just a product of late stage capitalism, or has there always been this kind of subtext or expectation in that transaction?
I think for me it was very interesting. By the way, beautiful story, and I think those to experience that's you can feel it when something is given unconditionally and without expectation, and there's actually it's such a beautiful experience. So I mean, I write about how for me that sort of that giving without expecting something is really something I have to try really hard to practice. It's nothing that comes naturally. I'm kind of like still training myself. Um, and yeah, but coming back to your question, which I've slightly lost track of now, it was to
Well,
do.
I'm just curious about this idea that's now permeated this question of
Oh yeah,
hospitality. It is
hospitality
an
industry.
industry,
Yeah.
which you do say it's kind of a paradox, really, in terms of what was perhaps
Yes, well, the
before.
word's been co-opted. I mean, this word it's like a philosophical term, a religious term. It has sort of so many other resonances. But in English, it's not actually used so often. And even if you Google, the first things that come up are to do with the industry and catering, and it's sort of really diminished because it has almost, I don't know. Yeah, as you said, a very transactional quality to it, and I think that sense has permeated so many aspects of our society, even our politics, in terms of this idea of the welfare state. Like you only deserve what you put in, and that who deserves. That this is also then another a question that has become quite debated, and I think that's actually it really diminishes our I think our natural impulses to include and to give and to share. And I think that mentality of the one who pays the most gets the best, and you only deserve it if you can pay for it, and if you can't, there must be something wrong with you. And when there could actually be many other factors influencing why somebody can't pay for something or contribute towards something. And that this is, I mean, I was talking in particular about the UK in writing about that because the shrinking of the social state over the last years and the lack of protection for the most vulnerable in society, I think is a consequence of this hospitality industry mentality. And so I think that these things, they tend to permeate the culture in many ways that we're perhaps not always conscious of, or at least not conscious of, that there are connections. And it became very apparent to me while I was writing that there is a very strong connection. I mean, in terms of America, I must say I find it quite it's sort of shall we say, the epitome of that is of course the Trump brand, which is on hotels and things everywhere. And when, you know, the idea of hospitality and that word and that name together, it's like a contradiction in terms, but of course it sells, and that seems quite perverse too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a worse example of sort of how, you know, the idea of an industry around such things has sort of attenuated culture in this way that has made, you know, just put so much distance between people who are enfranchised and disenfranchised. And we're seeing it so much right now. But to not get too bogged down in Trump, because quite honestly, that I could just derail myself badly on that subject. But I sort of, just to pivot for a moment, I would love if you could talk a little bit about something you get to towards the end of the book, which is this idea that sort of social media has entered the vernacular of hospitality too. I've written to some extent for an art magazine a little while ago about the manner in which food has been sort of fetishized and commodified and commercialized by platforms like Instagram. And I did some of the same sort of research that I think you did, looking at these vast, you know, meals that were had at different points in history, you know, 52 course, you know, meals for kings, or, you know, and Louis XIV's fetishization of various foods. I read, and I'm not sure if it's apocryphal, but that Louis XIV had English peas shipped to him from England, which, as they didn't grow quite in the same way in France, in crates full of roses to keep them fresh, which was just like the most lavish sounding, absurd thing, but such a beautiful image of just but just this idea that even the language itself around food has been co-opted in social media. You know, the stream of images that we look at on Instagram being called a feed, for instance. And you remind us early on in the book that eating is, you know, this really basic core human thing that we all do to sustain ourselves and preserve ourselves and perpetuate our lives. And we all have this in common. It's something we must do to survive. But I wonder how, I'd love to hear your take on how you think of something that's so primal and so basic being sort of co-opted and sublimated in digital culture.
I think in a way, perhaps it's inevitable that the things that are second nature and that are so expressive of who we are then get used for other associations. So perhaps it's not so much the surprise that it happens, but maybe the ways in which it happens. The section that you talk about is one of my my favorite ones, because I think it sort of it shows in a way that I love the technique that I used when I was writing, was that I allowed myself to write very freely and associatively. And the things that came together under this banner of hospitality was sometimes so surprising. And as with cooking, I really enjoyed the fact that things could sit together that you wouldn't expect to find together. And in that particular section, I actually start with some thoughts from the French epicure Priya Basil and his reflection on the senses, and then I go to Hannah Arendt and her reflections on Kant's critique of judgment, which was originally called Critique of Taste, and where she talks about thinking as a sense and as a sensation, and that faculty of judgment, of judging what is appropriate as a sense and as a communal sense. And then from there to go to these hashtags like hashtag food porn and hashtag eat clean, which are very, I think, expressions of a certain kind of identity too, of a certain placement of oneself in a community. And so these sort of loose associations, you know, were really fun to make. And I think the way that we think about and express food and identity. For me, in that particular part of the book, it showed how so much of these moments where, you know, things come into the popular culture and are kind of reproduced also. I mean, the size of the followings on these platforms, that there's something, I guess, I don't know, I've lost my train of thought slightly there, but for me, it was an interesting expression of this, the ways in which food mark us and the way in which we want to use these markers then to re-emphasize aspects of ourselves.
I think that's I think that's really interesting and salient. I mean, given sort of the way that, especially in a moment like this where everything's online, it's like the only way to really show the world who we are. Although, of course, it's a very fractional, very manufactured image, you know. And it's been interesting actually to see my mom on Instagram, because she's generally a Luddite who doesn't have a computer and really only can operate her, you know, phone as a means to communicate both via text message, but also she uses Instagram. And her entire sort of pedagogy, I don't know if you know about this project that she started called the Edible Schoolyard, which was, it just now in its 25th year. And it's this nonprofit program that was begun at a public school in Berkeley, that had a sort of derelict looking facade and trash strewn yard that the kids would play in. And my mom sort of said something offhand in a newspaper and was then called up by the principal. And so he was like, "Do you want to do something about it?" You know, it was this school that was just a 5-minute walk from Chez Panisse, really. So she ended up a couple years in, you know, they tore up the asphalt and they planted this beautiful garden. And the students now work in that garden as part of their, it's a classroom really. So they have math classes out there where they'll measure the beds or they'll thresh ancient grains and learn about other cultures, and they cook and eat communally. And it's something that's so reliant on sort of what you mentioned with Bria Severin, focusing on the senses, which is then something that really permeates Maria Montessori's pedagogy. My mom went to London in the 60s to study Montessori, so that's very much a foundational part of her thinking about these things. And then just to watch culture move in this way, where these things that are so critical to the way that our neural pathways are developed through touching and smelling and tasting, and have been brought into this this completely virtual space where we don't have any access to smell or touch. I mean, we might have a sort of sense of how something might taste looking at it, but you know, we don't really.
But I think there's also a really wonderful aspect to the sharing that happens online with food, with recipes, with blogs. I think there's been it's the exchange that's happened. I mean, I say in my book that, you know, recipes are the original open source, and I think that the internet, for all the things we can critique about it, and there's plenty, there is also this sense in which the possibilities for us to discover things and exchange and share have been enhanced. And I think that's a really wonderful aspect of what this space has opened for people.
I love that. I loved that section in the book where you talk about this idea of food really being open source, that there can be recipes that are sort of sometimes credited, but sometimes reinvented, that, you know, might have an original root, but even that person might have also adopted it from elsewhere. But it's been an interesting time, I think, around this subject, and especially around this question of, you know, appropriation, which has come to the fore in progressive culture, especially as a sort of reaction to this awakening for a huge part of the demographic of the US around the historic but also contemporary brutality towards certain groups of people. And you see it sort of resonating or bubbling up into this sort of I mean, tastemaker level of things on Instagram, where people are like Gwyneth Paltrow is sharing the mic and, inviting people to come onto her platform and, speak to her audience, but also through, cooks really heavily acknowledging where the recipes are coming from and trying to more carefully tell those stories. And it's been an interesting thing to negotiate. I mean, I have a small brand called Permanent Collection, and it's a design brand, and we just recently made a tortilla press, and we're two white women who made this tortilla press, and the person who designed it was my business partner's husband, who's German, and he's a wonderful product designer, and he had made this tortilla press because a few years ago when we were still in London, because we couldn't find a tortilla press anywhere in London. We were like scrambling around trying. I had brought masa from California, and several people had brought up this idea that we didn't really have the right to make this object, and that it was treading on. And I'm not even saying, and this is not in defense of our decision to do it, but it was an interesting thing that we hadn't not considered. We just had grown up, as two Californians making tortillas at home, and Mexican culture is so endemic to Californian culture, even intertwined with Californian culture. And I think it's been an interesting moment. I don't know if you've thought a lot or considered the ways in which this time has sort of amplified or added focus around these issues of who owns what, and what can be claimed as something of your own versus like something that's borrowed elsewhere. You do bring up a little anecdote about your Brazilian friends using chilies and coriander, and you sort of understanding.
But I think I do also write about how what's on the plate opens up this whole story about different journeys that ingredients have made around the world. And I think it's very fascinating that the things that we often consider to be sort of most authentically ours, whether it's potatoes or tomatoes, which like potatoes in Ireland or tomatoes in Italy, they came from Latin America. So that our plates open up whole histories, and histories of exchange, and of course of exploitation and colonialism, and these stories they have their darker sides, and they also have kind of their better moments, and their moments of kind of things meeting and transforming each other in positive ways. So yeah, it is a very loaded subject too. And then of course the environmental implications of what's on our plate, and this idea of hospitality to history, hospitality to the planet, that it's something that we extend. It's a kind of attentiveness and a kind of willingness to think about what we're doing and how we're eating and how we're treating each other, and also what we're using of the world around us, and then all these things, I guess, combine to define our sense of hospitality and how we want to move in the world.
I love that question of our extending hospitality to a really like global perspective, that it's not just about who's in front of us, but actually to how we think about the choices that we make and how they might affect the environment and the climate. I mean, you mentioned that you're a vegetarian, and having made those decisions, I suppose, were those climate decisions that undergirded that choice, or what drove that shift?
Well, I read Jonathan Safran Foer's Eating Animals, and after that it was not possible any longer.
I know.
I have lived with my husband, who I've lived with now for 22 years, was vegetarian the whole time. And so this ethical question was always there, but it's so interesting how we can also ignore things that are right there. It took a while to, I think I've now been vegetarian for around 10 years. And that book lay around for a while too before I actually read it. So we also resist the things that we know to be right. And that's also kind of, I think, estranging that we practice consciously or unconsciously. And yeah, I write about also this to be vegetarian, the way it made me feel very insecure as a host, because I worried about just feeding people vegetarian food, and this idea of the kind of status that different ingredients have on the table. And for me, I think also vegetarianism was also about, although I guess one would need to make the step to veganism to really live out the principles. But I'm really strongly in favor of doing things even if you can't do them completely. Like I don't think not being able to do something fully is a reason not to do it. I think it's better to have done a bit than not at all, out of fear of not being able to. But also the speciesism that's inherent in how we look at the planet and think of ourselves as sort of, you know, the top of the chain, and the kind of disregard and disrespect that we have for many other animals, particularly animals that we farm to eat. So all these things came into play, and then of course got a very particular attention in the writing of this book, because I mean that's one of the really sort of daunting things about writing such a book about unconditional hospitality, which is that there's a sort of onus that you feel also to practice what you've written. And I think the only way I can handle that is in the understanding that that Derrida lays out right away, which is that the task is impossible, but the attempt makes for a very interesting life, and a life that's full of stumbles, but which is also full of learning and discovery.
I do feel like there's some sort of settling on in a productive way, in a manageable way, this idea that you do have to just get somewhere down the road. You know, you have to do your best. That in this question that returns again and again, in terms of how you're thinking about this, about the langar, and how actually open it is to the stranger, and you know, thinking about what that meant in terms of just the architecture of its isolation in Kenya, behind gates, behind closed doors, with guards, through to deciding to visit a langar at the temple in Berlin with your husband, even after you had, you know, become an atheist and were no longer practicing in that capacity, and just trying to dissect and understand what that generosity really meant in that context. But that there was just a sort of almost like coming to terms with the idea that like there will never quite be enough, but you have to do something, I think is kind of the most salient lesson from this book in general. At least for me, it was like, you can't do nothing. You must do something, but you won't ever do as much as you hope, you know, but that's in a way like that might be the unachievable ideal, you know. But anyways, sorry to get slightly off topic, but I feel like one of the things, but there is like a little pervasive anxiety, which I hinted at the beginning with my first question, of just like, of this negotiation, how it like unsettles you because you know that you're not necessarily living up to what that ideal might be. And it sort of feels like it may be a good moment to just read a tiny little passage, because I feel like the passage that you mentioned to me before the call began, about your grandmother and the atmosphere of her table sort of might be you know, a little kernel that that for you is part of like all the complex emotional negotiations at the table, and also of how you then present in the world as someone who's trying to be hospitable to others.
Yeah, I would love to read something. Just before I do, though, just on that question of, you know, the kind of not being able to achieve this impossible. I do actually think that we actually do in certain instances anyhow, especially I think in our intimate relationships. I think if you think about situations where you forgive something that you were sure you couldn't forgive, or you managed to do something and to give where you just wouldn't have thought you could have done that. And so there are always these moments in which we surprise ourselves with what we can do. And those for me are the kind of, you know, the precious gem moments of our capacities. And I guess what I'm really interested in is how we may be able to extend that, like outside the immediate circle of love and friendship and acquaintance. and what might happen if we were able, in just in small instances now and then, to achieve that with people we don't know, or just towards the planet, just in other ways. But let me read a passage.
Just a tiny passage, and then I think we'll take some questions. But I just love, because at the core of this book, really, food and your family's tables. So so it left such an incredible impression and seemed like it was really the impetus for you for this book. So it would be great to just have a little sense of it.
Well, it was one of the impetuses. The thing with my grandmother, Mumji, is that she has a tendency to take over. I talk about her or whatever. So here she is again, hijacking the event as I read a passage.
She'll be happy.
The book is so much about my mom as well, and I always feel really bad that I hardly talk about my wonderful mother. And my wonderful but very dominating grandmother steals the day again. She's an amazing cook, friends and family say about Mumji, before grudgingly adding, but she never shares a recipe. Perhaps for this reason, Mumji has no really close friends. It's probably also why she finds it hard to ask for recipes. Instead, she eats with sharp attentiveness, turning food over with her fingers, scanning, sniffing, and sucking in search of spice traces. Sometimes she delves deeper with seemingly casual questions. Some people put Javan in everything because it's good for digestion. What do you think? Afterwards, she'll remark to us how disappointing the dishes were. Jussie has no idea what flavors go together. Who puts sweet corn with fish? Or John really fancies himself a chef, but he doesn't have a clue. Did you see the number of cloves in that chicken? Soon, if not the very next day, the family might be treated to a variation on a dish recently tasted somewhere, at Jussie's or John's. I don't know if I have time to continue. I think I will just take another 2 minutes.
You do.
You can feast on Mumji's food, but rarely do you get to do so with her. The first time my husband dined at her table, an invitation that finally came more than a year after we'd met, he followed the example set by the rest of us and filled his plate from the spread laid out for his welcome. But when we started tucking in, he waited. What about Mumji? He pointed to the empty chair. She's not coming yet, I told him. Just start, the other said. Still, he hesitated, disabled by a decorum that dictated you don't begin eating until everyone is seated and served. A few minutes later, Mumji entered the dining room bearing a fresh batch of chapatis, aprons sprayed with flour, cheeks red from heat. She went around offering the rotis, but stopped short at the sight of my husband's untouched food. Eat, she ordered. And when he tried to explain, she cut him off. I'm working so hard, so you getting everything hot, 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 and you letting everything go all cold. Eat! He obeyed, and ever after, reluctantly accepted her peculiar protocol. Part of Mumji's purpose in serving is to survey how much people are ingesting. She keeps a mental tab on the amount of helpings taken, the bowls of dal refilled, the number of rotis eaten. She remembers how much you had last time and is upset if you don't outdo yourself at each subsequent meal. When my brother and cousins were teenagers, they could easily consume many rotis apiece. Mumji would gloat and report as if some world record had been broken. He ducked 11. There is a special word for it, because, of course, nobody just eats her food. They dup, as if it were their last meal on earth. Dup, a slangy Punjabi sound, which I like to believe Mumji invented. To dup is to eat with abandon and to excess. It's a wonderful, reckless activity that often comes with a high price tag of remorse and indigestion. This does not deter dedicated duppers. Nowadays, each of the boys, as Mumji still calls them, though all are grown men, might manage 6 rotis, a healthy appetite by any standards. But Mumji, still nostalgic for the heydays of dupping, continues to roll out dozens of flatbreads. They puff up on her small cast iron cover to sighs of disappointment and mutterings about how these days everyone is on a diet. She cooks for the moments when someone's appetite will breach the quotidian limits of consumption, and she can rejoice.
Thank you. That was the perfect passage, I think, before Thanksgiving over here in the United States.
Yes,
Where we
absolutely.
are all going to
Same
duck
thing.
regardless of who or how many people get to come this year. So thank you for that, Priya. I think there are a couple of questions. Should we do this?
There are, for sure. So Erin would like to know, what was the catalyst, Priya, for the book? And how did it or didn't it change after you discovered things in your research?
Well, I mentioned that the family was really important. And the other really key thing was moving to Germany and having this experience of becoming part of another society. I mean, when I went to Germany, I didn't speak the language. I didn't know anybody in Berlin where I moved apart from my husband, who was then my boyfriend. And so this experience of taking root in a place and feeling like a guest to begin with, but then also feeling how your relationship to a place changes because you can also contribute and not just be seen as a guest, but really like be there on your own terms. And then a very key turning point was the experience of being in Germany in 2015, 2016, when many refugees came to Europe, mainly from Syria, but also Afghanistan. And many European countries didn't let these people in. And Germany is one of the few countries, along with Sweden and one or two others, that opened its borders. And so in the first year, we had around 800,000, mainly Syrian refugees arriving in Germany. And I had never been in a society where the onus was on me to welcome and to be open to who was coming. I had always had this privilege of moving quite easily because of my passport and choosing to move, like not moving out of compulsion. And this was a really sort of destabilizing experience. I felt really insecure all of a sudden about my position in this society, where I had certain advantages because of being the newcomer, so to speak. And even though I was so privileged, it also really disturbed me that I would feel insecure about other people coming. And part of how I dealt with that insecurity was to get really involved, and I helped found an NGO that worked with the arriving refugees called Wir Machen Das. We're doing it, which is still going, and it's now a very successful organization, which is with many people who came at that time working in it. And I was really fascinated by this sort of wobble, if I can call it that I had in that moment, and how it made me think about my own moving and my own responsibilities in a different way. So that became a very key catalyst in thinking about the book and thinking in these broader terms of hospitality.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a very nice question.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think it's, I mean, just the fact that that's that approach that you took when you felt that wobble, you decided it was something you needed to delve a lot deeper on. I'm grateful that you made that choice because I think it's revealed a lot in your really, really lovely book. So thank you. Erin would also like to know, I think this comes from the design student in her. She says, really inspired and loved to be my guest. I'm curious, what was the inspiration for the different book covers? And I think there she's talking about the UK versus the US book cover. She's especially in love with the bright yellow and rich blue of the UK cover, but also the simplicity of the US one. And actually, for those of you out there who would like to be able to see that, Priya on her website actually has both of the covers, so you can look at those if you would like.
Yeah, oh, well, thank you so much for appreciating both of them. I think they're gorgeous as well. And the UK one, I think that in the cover, they wanted to reflect the kind of the many different aspects of the book and the many different cultures that also shape my thinking and my life. And so if you look carefully at the cover, the different symbols, I think the bean is Kenya, and then the porcelain, Germany, and then some of the kind of paisley pattern, India. So it's an amazing kind of creation by the designer. And when I first saw it, I was just stunned by how beautiful it was. And I said, there has to be something imperfect because it's too perfect. My book is exactly against the idea of perfection. It's about, those things that kind of break our sense of what is and open us up to something new. And so then the designer did something absolutely marvelous, and she put a little flaw. Well, it's not a flaw, but it's something that breaks the pattern in there. One of the tureens is open, and there's a little bit of steam coming out, and the spoon is there, it's ready to serve. So I really liked it that there's just so much thought and care, and it's just a beautiful book to hold as well. And I had no idea what would come with the American edition. And when I first saw it, and it was next to the British one, like just the picture, I just received a copy 2 weeks ago, I think. It was so understated, and that contrast was really striking to me. But then when I got it and the book is in my hand, I really think, I don't know, one can't really say one has favorites with book covers, because so much care and thought goes into all of them. It's a bit like my sister has twins, and when I'm holding one, I'm like, you're my favorite. When I'm holding the other, I think you're my favorite. So I feel like that with the book covers, and like, you're my favorite right now. But I think it really fits the moment in its kind of, it's so elegant and so beautiful and such a wonderful addition to hold. And yet I think for this moment, its understatedness is somehow really appropriate, because it's such a difficult moment in so many ways, and there's so much suffering and deprivation and hardship and desperation for so many people. And to talk about generosity and community can maybe feel very grating for people who are alone and just feeling really isolated and cut off and without a perspective. But I think the tone that they caught, and just the suggestion of the book that it's a sort of, something that maybe there's something modest in it too. I really like that, because that's something I really grapple with in this notion of hospitality. If you can have modesty in it, because hospitality, it's so connected with the idea of abundance and having more than you need. That's our idea of what it is to give to, especially at the table, to people, that there should be more than everybody could possibly want. And yet I think that if one thinks about our time and the planet and the needs of others, then there's also a necessity for a kind of modesty. And how do we, I haven't found out the answer to that riddle. My table is like my grandmother's, really overloaded always. But I'm conscious of this need for also a modesty and an awareness in how we even in how we are really generous.
All right, I think that's an absolutely wonderful way to end things today. Thank you so much, Fanny, for the lovely conversation, and Priya for joining us again, almost 10 o'clock where you are. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be here with you.
It was a delight, and congratulations on your really marvelous book.
Thank you so much. Thank
you.
you.
I understand that you have another book coming on feminism. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that in case anyone's interested in what you've got next?
Yeah, it's called In Us and Now, Becoming Feminist. And I guess in a way it's connected to this book in that it's about thinking not of the self always in relation to others. And I was particularly inspired by an experience I had with doing an edition of Vogue with 39 other women, and this kind of collective force of acting together in a space which is obviously so saturated with power and racism and sexism, and what was possible with acting in concert with others, inspired this reflection on feminism. And the book is in two parts, and the second talks about that Vogue experience, and the first is it also looks at my relationship with my mom and Mumji. Mumji, as always, is a heroine in everything I write. I'm so indebted to her. But yeah, this it's the same mixture of kind of personal, philosophical, and social analysis.
Wonderful. We'll look forward to that. We carry a very small selection of sort of, feminist social justice and just like fiction that we like at the store in addition to cookbooks. So we'll be sure
Yeah.
that one ends up on the shelf too.
Oh,
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for tuning in and joining us. Have a lovely, safe holiday if you are celebrating this week. And again, thank you so much, Fanny and Priya.
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you. Thank you
Good
all for
evening.
being with
Thank
us.
you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye.